Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. I know that there are a ton of other things that you could be doing right now, but we appreciate you being here and showing your dedication to your learners and to yourself in your role as educators. So I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Eva as our 2019 Teach Education Day presenter. He's kind of a big deal on the medical education circuit. His 102-page CV contains just a little part of that. But I'm just going to cover the basics of that CV so that we're not here well into the evening. So Dr. Eva is Associate Director and Senior Scientist of the Center for Health Education Scholarship, Professor and Director of Educational Research and Scholarship in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Eva completed his undergraduate degree with a minor in biology and PhD in experimental psychology at McMaster University. He also completed a fellowship in health professions education through McMaster. He became editor-in-chief for the Journal of Medical Education in 2008, so if anybody's planning anything in the future, hit him up. Dr. Eva has consulted broadly around the globe, including advisory roles for the NBME and the National Health Services Education through Scotland. He co-founded the Canada Master of Health Professions Education Program and works extensively with the Medical Council of Canada and the College of Physicians and Surgeons of British Columbia. Dr. Eva has published extensively on a variety of topics related to health professions education, some of which were foundational to my dissertation, including narrative assessment, critical thinking, performance assessment, incentivizing medical educators, the multiple mini interview, which he was a huge part of in creating that whole process, and the accuracy of self-monitoring. His teaching and scholarship awards are what I like to call too numerous to count. They are indeed plentiful. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Eva for a presentation on self-regulation of professional practice, promoting insight in students.
Thank you very much. I can hear myself. That's working. Excellent. I just want to echo the sentiments that you just heard. I'm thrilled that you came out this lunch hour. I trust most of you are here for lunch rather than for me, so please do feel free to keep helping yourself as the hour wears on, and I will be quite happy to be interrupted either because you need to take a break at the back of the room, or if you have any comments or questions that you want to throw in as we go along. The topic for today is one that's near and dear to my heart. It's self-regulation and a variety of issues that are wrapped up in that. And specifically, what I'd like to spend some time talking with you about is how we might enable learners to better understand the strengths and gaps in their development, obviously in the hope of improving performance for us collectively as we move along. I'm using that word learners very deliberately because I believe everything I'm going to say is true for everyone from medical students on through the entirety of one's career. Some of the challenges I'm going to put forward are relevant to us just as much as they're relevant to our learners. And so one of the things that I hope you'll think about over the course of the next little while is how we might model some of the activities and behaviors I'll encourage you to think about at the same time as encouraging our learners to take those things on. So these are the questions that I plan to address. Again, more than happy to go off on a tangent if there's something else that you'd like to discuss. But really want to set the stage a little bit by saying, why are medical educators interested in this topic at all? What does the research literature tell us? And all that really building towards trying to better understand what we as educators can do to try to promote and encourage better practice for the sake of our students and the sake of our patients. So that as a starting point, let me just say, to get things started, that if you look internationally, every health profession that I've come across, when you look at their regulatory documents in terms of how the profession is expected to develop and maintain its competence, universally across all the health professions, across every country that I've looked at, and that PEC looked at in this 2000 review, it's been seen that the ability to self-assess is considered to be a cornerstone of professional self-regulation. I often think of this as the shampoo model of self-regulation, because whereas the shampoo bottle says lather, rinse, repeat, the idea here generally is that we should take stock of our own abilities, take steps to try to fill in any gaps we have in practice, and just repeat that over the course of our careers. In principle, it sounds very sensible, and it's driven partly by routine events like this one, where something has gone wrong, and it's often blamed on overconfidence, on an individual who's gone beyond their capacity. And if you've been in a role where you're trying to help students who are struggling, oftentimes we complain about their lack of insight and their seeming to be unaware of the limitations of their knowledge or abilities. I'm not going to belabor those examples, but again, this is just a simple model to get our conversation started in terms of where does the concern generally arise. Usually we start complaining and worrying about insight or self-assessment or a variety of related concepts because people have an inflated impression of their abilities. And why this has been built into so much of our conversation about how to perform well as a profession is saying that if we help people better understand the gaps in their practice, then what that will offer is some guidance regarding what they should work on. Provide some motivation, provides better awareness of their needs, and gives them some benchmarks to work towards, all with the goal that is ideal of individuals being competent and confident, able to do the things that we expect of them in their roles, and willing or comfortable to do those things as well. So, again, that is the goal, just a very brief overview of why it matters. Let me tell you a little bit about 40 years worth of research that has led us to have some concerns about whether or not that model is as simple as it might seem to be on the surface. If you've seen The Matrix, I'm going to ask you to swallow the blue pill for the next hour and think about some things that might seem intuitive to us, but maybe don't hold up to closer inspection. So I'm going to structure my comments around 4 illusions that I'd like you to consider. The first of which is simply stated as it being an illusion that we actually have unique insight into our own strengths or weaknesses, that we can become good self-assessors in any sort of generic way. I'm going to tell you one set of data, but this really is a 30 to 40-year-old literature. It's accumulated in a variety of different ways. This particular study I'm choosing primarily because it was our effort to correct a number of the methodological flaws that others had suggested were plaguing this literature. Again, we don't need to go into the details, but I'm happy to if anybody wants to afterwards. What we did was we asked students in the context of something we call a progress test, how many questions they were likely to get correct. And this was chosen in part because It's an objective outcome measure. We can just count how many questions they got correct. And the students in this study had a lot of experience with this tool. This was done at McMaster when I was there, and students sit this exam, or one of the same difficulty, every 4 months in practice. It's a way of giving them data so they can track how well their knowledge is growing over the course of time in the curriculum. So they know what they've scored on this in the past, and they should have a very good sense of how well they're likely to do as a result. When we asked them to estimate how many questions they would write before they actually sat the test, despite what I just said, the correlation was very much aligned with what we typically see in the literature. People were surprisingly poor at telling us whether or not they would succeed on this activity. When we asked them after the exam, how many questions did you get right? So they've now seen all the questions, and they've experienced that struggle of trying to determine which ones are they comfortable with and which ones do they struggle with. The correlation got better. Still not great. In fact, this is one of the higher correlations that you see in this literature. But what was most striking to us in this particular context is if they had simply told us the score they got on the previous exam, then the correlation would have been up over 0.7. And so they had all the data they needed to offer this judgment, but for a variety of reasons they just weren't doing so. Again, this has come up for 40 years. It's been a bit of a treadmill where we've seen results like this and thought that can't possibly be corrected. We know that we self-assess, we have much more experience with ourselves than we do with other people. How can it be that we have such low correlations? So the methodology has been tweaked over and over again. Challenges come forward where people say, I know I'll never play professional football, so therefore I must have some capacity to self-assess. We need to fix it. We need to teach it better. We're just not doing that. Or my favorite reaction is simply, yeah, I've met people like that. I laid out my favorite reaction because I think the most satisfying research result I've come across in my career was a study that showed that if you ask people how well they self-assess, just what everybody says they're above average. Completely undermining the message in the first place. Again, this is something that's developed over time. It's not often something that people readily grasp or feel entirely comfortable with. So let me just pause and ask you, do your reactions align with any of these, or is this an idea that is comfortable to you, that we struggle with these sorts of assessments?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll try again. Do you find that I agree with all of these things here? Yeah, I know, right? But do you see any sort of dichotomy in this? Like, there's definitely this is the predominant. This is clearly a predominant population of people. What do you do? There does seem to be another population of people that do have the looking at a line and the self-deluded, for lack of a better word, right? So how does that sort of fit into this paradigm?
So do you want to?
Well, to add to that, I was thinking the same thing. So for people who are successful, are they better at identifying people around them who provide a more accurate assessment if we're not self-assessing well? Or, what is helping the people who are successful achieve success and improvement? Is it external rather than internal?
Right. Yeah, so these are great questions, and in part because they actually speak fundamentally to whether or not skills are generic competencies. Right? So we talk about people as that person understands their abilities, or that person's a good communicator, or that person's struggling with collaborative activities. Each one of those things to a surprising degree, is context specific. We don't tend to be good communicators overall. We communicate better in areas that we know something about and we're more comfortable with, and communicate less well in areas where we're maybe not as fluent with the material. In this domain, for skills that one has capacity, you tend to appear to be a much better self-assessor than for skills where you don't have the capacity. And I'll show you some data in a little while to reinforce that. But the general notion is that the appearance of good self-assessment, that being able to judge whether or not you perform a task well, is actually driven by being able to perform the task. And so it's not the capacity to self-assess that allows you to do that, it's the capacity to do the task that makes it look like you know whether you're doing it well or not. And again, for any one of us, we're good at some things, we're bad at others, so we'll appear to be good self-assessors at some things and poor at others, but the question is, do we ever know when we're in one state or the other?
So you showed that there's a full correlation of the student's expectation of how they done, and then you say that people overestimate tend to have step better than average. With that full correlation, did you get overestimators and underestimators in that group?
Yeah, as a general rule, for socially desirable activities anyway, people tend to overestimate more than they underestimate. There's something called the Lake Wobegon effect. Some of you might have come across. The slogan of the camp is, all of our kids are above average. Right? By definition, this can't be possible. But where people show up in a study like that in terms of whether they're overestimators or underestimators is very much an artifact of the difficulty of the tests. If I gave them a very easy test, they would appear to be underestimators because their perceptions of their abilities in a certain domain are not going to change, but they get high scores relative to what they might have expected. If I give them a very difficult test, they'll appear to be overestimators. So the overall difference in average doesn't give us a lot of information. It's the difficulty of knowing where you stand relative to your colleagues that I think is particularly important. And I'll come back to that though in a few minutes. It's an important issue. And we can go on probably for an entire term talking about this literature. It's so vast, but it is extensive. There have been many literature reviews conducted in different areas, not just medical education. Generally, they've all come to the same conclusion, that self-assessment ability is poor. Again, I'm not going to belabor the issue, but I just want to do a little exercise just as one way of reinforcing why this is so fundamentally difficult for us. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to trust me just for 10 seconds and close your eyes. This is a very trusting group because all but one of you readily did that. I just want you to imagine for 10 seconds or so yourself driving. Open your eyes again. Was that a challenging task? I hope not. Just despite the fact that everybody's hungry or just filled themselves up. It's a fairly easy thing to do. Can somebody tell me about the vision that you just had when you were thinking about your self-driving? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was in my white car driving on Franklin Rover Street. I'm sure I'm new.
It's okay.
So and I noticed the traffic and I changed lanes and I drove until there was a stoplight that was red and I stopped and then I was going to turn right.
Okay.
To come to the hospital.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's a very detailed and very specific situation where you're following a path that you're familiar with, even though the names of the streets maybe weren't all that important. Can you tell me what was on the radio? Can you tell me what happened at work the day before you made that drive?
Sure, I gave a talk yesterday on.
Sorry, I don't mean the day before today, but when you were imagining an actual drive. Yeah. Yeah, so I just mean as a general principle, if you think about yourself driving, you're actually thinking of a specific moment in time, right?
Well, I mean, I thought your question was about yesterday, but you meant yesterday in the driving.
I mean, in the scenario you just imagined, yeah, yesterday in that scenario, did you know what happens the day before?
I wasn't paying great attention to that.
Sorry, it's a weird question, I realize, but that's actually what I'm trying to elicit, is that all of you had no trouble imagining yourselves driving, at least by the nods in the room, but there are a lot of details that inevitably get left out, right? There are things that impact on how safely we drive that don't tend to come to mind when we think about how well do I drive or imagine ourselves driving in a particular situation. Those details will obviously determine the outcome, right? Even the worst drivers among us, they don't get into an accident even 1% of the time that they take their car out, right? It's a very rare occurrence. And so the things that are very readily available to memory are the things that tend to drive our perceptions of whether or not we do something well. The details are out there. We don't know what's distracting us. We don't know if we had a rough night the day before. We don't know if we're hungry and therefore looking down at the granola bar that might be sitting on our passenger seat instead of actually focusing on the road. It's those details that determine what actually happens, but don't generally influence our assessment of our capacity to do a task. Taking that one step further, for how many of you was the day that you were imagining sunny? 63.2% of you. If, again, you go through scenarios like this, generally what you think of is people in idealized situations, right? There's not a lot of traffic, typically. Usually it's a warm, sunny day, the roads are dry. We're not generally focused in our imaginations about driving, about pedestrians darting out in the middle of the road. The most typical scenario, the easy situations, are the ones that come to mind most readily. And we know from basic psychology that things that come to mind more readily tend to be thought of as more probable. So we get into this habit of imagining ourselves driving well or communicating effectively or working well in clinic. And that drives our sense of our ability levels as a general rule, even though the details, as I said, are what matter. So all that is just an elaborate, weird way of saying that when we ask people to self-assess, we tend to imagine them as having unique access to their own thoughts or behaviors or experiences. But in fact, they're drawing inferences about their abilities, just like we draw inferences when we make a judgment of somebody else's performance. Okay, we're still using cues that can be quite fallible in determining whether or not we're actually able to perform a task. That's the glass half empty version of things. There's a reason for that rose-colored glasses type of optimism now. And that is quite simply that our perceptions of ourselves aren't simply reflections of our past performances, but they also help predict how well we'll perform in the future. That confidence is important to us, because if we don't believe we're capable of succeeding, the odds that we will succeed are much lesser. And this is just referencing some work done as early as the 70s, but that has been ongoing, suggesting that confidence that can seem like overconfidence when someone doesn't have the ability is actually something that will lead them to help develop the ability rather than simply a problem that needs to be overcome. We seem to have some implicit sense of that. If you talk to learners, again, at various levels and in multiple professions, we hear all the time ways in which people discount negative performances. Just as an example, some days I go home and I'm a good dog, but other days, if I had a headache, there's an external circumstance that helps us account for why that specific day maybe didn't go as well as some other days. We have never, to my recollection, heard people talk about how they just fluked into a good performance. We don't tend to find excuses for why things went well as readily as we find reasons to discount negative events. And again, it can sound like people are deluding themselves, but I think often we do this for an important reason. Caroline Moulton from the University of Toronto is a hepatobiliary surgeon, and she was trying to study those moments in the operating theater when people cue into the need to move out of automatic mode and really pay some focused attention. And so she got talking to people about when things went wrong. And they routinely say things like, this is a very dramatic example, but if things were going great, if only the resident hadn't put his thumb through the patient's heart. If only. And her argument in part, as she started exploring these things, became it's important to have these reflexes. Obviously, we need to do things about them and work with patient safety, but it's important to have these reflexes because otherwise those surgeons aren't going back into the operating room. Right? If they truly come to fundamentally believe that they're not capable, we're not going to have surgeons providing the care that's critically important to many of our patients. On the other side of things, we also have tendencies to seek the positive. These are some data collected from the United Kingdom where they developed a web-based feedback system for students who had gone through the OSCE. And the idea was to have everything documented so that people could continue to learn from that experience. When they tracked how readily people used the system, what they found was those who it was built for, the ones who were struggling the most, were actually less likely to use it. And the people who got excellent comments or ratings that felt very reinforced and kept going back to it over and over again as a way of feeling good. Maybe this was just their bedtime routine. I don't really know. We lose sight of the fact that when we get negative feedback, it can be quite jolting and creates a state of dissonance for us where we are trying and believe that we're progressing towards a certain end, but then have to grapple with these indications that maybe we're not doing as well as we thought we were. So again, that's just the foundation for what we really want to discuss, which is what do we do with this? How do we support students when we can't trust that any one of them has reliable, trustworthy access to their own abilities? And so here I'm going to offer 4 bits of advice based on my read of this literature. One is that we need to keep in mind always whose opinion matters the most to our students. Remember, they have at least 25 years worth of experience with themselves. They know what they've struggled with, or at least have perceptions of what they've struggled with, and they've had successes, or they wouldn't have gotten into medical school. Then we come in and sometimes are with them for no more than a few minutes or a few hours at best, and start passing on advice that is easy to discount if it's completely inconsistent with what they believe about themselves. When we looked at what was driving students to generate learning goals after an OSCE, we won't belabor things with the details too much, but it didn't matter what rating we believed they deserved. It didn't even matter how strong the feedback was in the students' own impressions. What determined whether or not they generated learning goals was their own perception of their own performance. So if we're to try to help students move beyond this struggle to know how well they're performing, we need to know what they think of themselves in order to make sure that what we're telling them doesn't just fall on deaf ears because it's contradictory or so inconsistent that they can't make sense of it. This is the cognitive dissonance issue that I was alluding to earlier. It leads me to this third illusion, which is we tend to romanticize how desperate our learners are for feedback. They tell us this all the time, so it's not completely our fault. But you hear all the time, and many empirical studies have shown students have a desire for more and more feedback. They feel like they don't get enough. As faculty, of course, our data suggests that we're giving them feedback, and they're just not recognizing it. But nonetheless, the reason I'm mentioning this is it doesn't take a lot of digging to start to see that when students say, I want more feedback, often what they're saying is, I want some reassurance. They want to have some indicator that they're on the right path. And in medicine, at least, we've established a culture where giving feedback is often seen as a sign that somebody's not doing well, because we ignore the people who are doing well. It hasn't become part of our normal processes to make sure that everybody is giving feedback in a way that might help us all move forwards. That leads me to say again, as my opening comments probably suggest, we need to think about skill development rather than trying to turn people into good self-assessors. And I'll try to illustrate what I mean by that by going back to that model. Rather than, as if we're giving feedback so that people's self-perception improves, what we should be thinking about is what feedback will help the student improve performance. And just allow the appearance of accurate self-assessment to come along for the ride. We don't need and probably shouldn't convince them that they're bottom dwellers, if in fact they are at the bottom of the class. What we need to do is help them move up the ranks and not worry about the fact that they maybe started in a way that was overconfident. And I'll try to illustrate that with just this really simple study. This has become a classic in the literature. It actually won the Ig Nobel Prize for research that first makes people laugh and then makes people think. This has been replicated in medicine, but the data I'll show you is done with undergraduate psychology students. They were given a test on grammar, and then they were split into quartiles. So by definition, got better as you move up each quartile. When they asked people to judge how strong their grammar was, got a very different impression, fairly flat line. Even those in the first quartile generally believed their grammar ability was above average. Why the study was so influential is what this simply reinforces what I've said has been done dozens of times. It's self-assessment is core. But Kruger and Dunning took it a step further and said maybe it's not self-assessment, maybe it's that we don't know how good our peers are. And so they showed the test responses for half a dozen peers to each participant and then said to them, now how do you think you did? And so the good performers, those in the fourth quartile, should be able to look at their peers' responses and say, I'm actually better than most of these schmoes, and raise their self-assessments accordingly, which is exactly what they did. The interesting part was down the other end, those in the first quartile, also said, I'm better than most of these schmoes. And it led Kruger and Dunning to title the paper Unskilled and Unaware of It. They said we have the equivalent of a perceptual blindness. If you don't have skill in an area, you don't know how to judge whether or not you have skill in that area. Because if you did know what made for good grammar, you'd be using good grammar and you wouldn't be down at that bottom end. Why I'm presenting the study in this moment is to say that in their follow-up study, they actually taught people how to use grammar appropriately. So they moved them to the right along this curve. And when they did that, of course, their self-assessments appeared to be more accurate because their performance improved to meet it. It wasn't that they were able to get better performance by convincing people that their self-assessment was poor. Which more generally leads me to the statement that what we need to ensure students have access to is better data. We need to create opportunities for them to discover the boundaries of their knowledge, because that's going to have more influence than anything that we tell them. There's a large literature on something called test-enhanced learning. It's the notion that if you take a test, you come to learn the material better than if you study it multiple times. These data are a real-world example of that. This is McMaster's performance on the national licensing exam that we use in Canada. It's the equivalent to your USMLE. McMaster is globally known as being an exceptional educational institution. It created problem-based learning. It has spread many of its innovations around the globe. Its deep, dark secret was that they had a failure rate on the national exam that was 5 times the national average. And this was not an issue of problem-based learning versus conventional education, because every year in this is a problem-based learning year. What happened was that early on in the curriculum, for the first 20 years or so, the philosophy that led them towards problem-based learning meant that education needed to be student-centered. And tests were the opposite. They were teacher-centered because it required a teacher to decide what students needed to know. And so for that first 20 years, from 1969 to about 1989, they got no feedback beyond what their tutor told them and beyond what they themselves could suss out from their experiences. The disconnect in this line is when they implemented that progress test that I mentioned at the start of this talk. When they started actually giving people an examination that gave them hard data that would allow them to reliably and validly track their progress, then that enabled a massive jump in performance, and the assessment system and a variety of other things became more robust over time, and at least made it to the point that Jeff Norman felt like he was allowed to share these data publicly. I'm curious to see your experiences in terms of where you get data to support your own practices or your own determinations about what you need to do to continue to maintain your competence. These are a few examples of things that I know to be used down here in the States, where different organizations, certifying bodies and others have tried to create systems to get data into people's hands that will help better inform their performance. Do you have any experiences with one of these or something else that you felt has worked well in terms of being able to enable you to judge your performance? Silence is a distressing thing in this particular moment.
We use the Sim Center a lot for
So you're actually going into the Sim Center and deliberately practicing.
And simply them coming up with a scenario that they think people should be able to navigate effectively, go in there and see what needs to be done, and then taking areas in what way, maybe getting some insight into what your peers are expected to do.
Yeah. So so getting some opportunity to even just have these conversations, right? The simulation itself may be valuable, but as much as anything, it might just be a stimulus to find out what other people are doing. And oftentimes we don't even need to disclose that we would have done something different, but being able to hear what other people do makes you think twice about, maybe I should tweak what I'm doing and see if it improves anything. Any other examples? What patient study? What sort of things do they tell you?
I'm better or not better.
So their actual improvement or not is, right, so in specific situations, you might get some feedback on whether or not you're managing that case effectively. It's an interesting example because Eric Holmbo and others have put forth some data that suggests that when we think about patient profiles as a whole, we're actually quite bad at even telling others what our patient population looks like. And so as a generic process of thinking about how are my patients doing overall, it's a very difficult thing to get a handle on, but I agree with you, in individual instances, that can be a very informative piece of information. The question is always, how do we aggregate that into something bigger so that we know how we're doing in general rather than just in those moments. Let me move on from this, but again, these models, they're coming about because of increased awareness that people just don't have access to the information that they need to judge whether or not they're performing effectively. It's something that Robert Bjork has called desirable difficulties. It's a very compelling model suggesting that mistakes don't simply help us learn, they're necessary for our learning. And learners, especially trainees, they don't tend to spontaneously put themselves in situations where they'll make mistakes. It's not as reinforcing or as fun thing to do, right? Even as those OSCE data alluded to, we tend to seek the positive outcomes. And so our role as educators in part is to make sure that people are getting those opportunities to experience mistakes in a safe environment where they can actually engage in learning and force themselves beyond whatever threshold they've achieved. Which leads me finally just to a broader point about how we need to think carefully about our own engagement with our trainees. That our models of feedback often amount more to dumping data on students rather than actually engaging in a feedback conversation. This literature review that I'm quoting on this slide looked at a variety of different interventions for how teaching performance could improve. And the intervention that was most robust in its effectiveness was the presence of a coach. It was having somebody with whom you could dialogue. You could share your perceptions of things, have them prompt other questions or offer ideas as to ways in which you might continue to improve. Because again, by definition, if you're struggling with a particular task, you're probably not the right person to decide how to get beyond that, because you're struggling, and if you knew how to get beyond it, you'd be doing that already. Critically important in those sorts of conversations is that the coach or the feedback provider maintains credibility. Students don't listen if they don't believe that the source is credible. And in this study, Joan Sargent pointed out that the credibility has multiple dimensions. It's not simply whether or not you have the clinical skill to know what you're talking about, but rather it also demands credibility in terms of what is this person's motivation for giving me this feedback? Do I feel like they're here to help me get better, or just because they have a job to do, they're going through the motions, or they want to demonstrate that they're so much smarter than I am? Students respond well when they feel a connection with someone and want to grow with them as a result. So those models that I'm sure are embedded in all of your feedback workshops that you say, give a limited number of feedback points, mix the positive with the negative. They're all grounded in very good principles. But as soon as that practice becomes algorithmic and it seems like you're just going through the motions, you've already lost. I can't tell you how many times I've said something positive to a student and had them slouch and brace because they feel like the negative must be coming in the middle because they almost feel set up at that point. So this is why there's so much emphasis being put on feedback or educational processes now as being about an educational alliance. I don't mean that you need to become best friends with your learners. I don't mean you need to take them for dinner. But the learners need to feel like part of what you're doing is trying to help support their well-being. That you're there in a mutually collaborative alliance to try to help them be as good as they can be. Which really all four of those things that I've just tried to base this talk around is really my effort to say that we need to change the culture. We need to start thinking about self-regulation as being helping people understand that they can't rely on themselves. We need to make people are comfortable with seeking data, recognize how important it is to do so. I start to identify the cues or the bits of data that help inform them as opposed to getting in the way. And find ways through educational alliances and other ways to try and optimize the degree to which people are receptive to whatever data they can get their hands on. So in addition to that little bit of summary, I'll just finish with 4 quick slides, 2 of which I hope reinforce the take-home messages that I've tried to convey, and 2 of which I hope make you feel a little bit less comfortable, even if you're already not terribly comfortable. Just to explain that, I think one of the things I'm trying to stress is that we need to think of education as learning what you didn't know you didn't know. And you can't tell students you don't know this. You need to try to create opportunities for them to discover if it's really going to be impactful. There are good guides out there for how to deliver feedback, how to help students work on their performance. Valerie Shute has a very good paper in this regard. It comes to the conclusion that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You need to be cognizant of the contextual demands. But critical in her conclusion was also that feedback is effective to the extent that learners are receptive to it. And so we need to think carefully about how do we avoid getting into a situation where we're telling learners something that's so inconsistent with what they believe that we might as well be talking to the table instead of to an individual. In terms of the discomfort, I think the most important thing I can say in all this is that it's going to go wrong. There is no magic bullet. I can stand here as someone who's explored this literature and experimented with these sorts of issues a lot. But there's nothing you can do that will make it work well every single time. So I've started thinking of feedback as improv. There are a bunch of principles or rules that help steer the conversation, but you need to be prepared to get on your feet. And most important is just staying engaged. I can't help but disclose a specific situation I had recently with a postdoctoral candidate who was working with me for about 18 months, and that entire time kept telling me how frustrating she found Canadian diplomacy. She felt like Canadians were too nice. We expected people to read between the lines and didn't actually say what we meant. I always felt like I was saying what I meant, but with English as a second language, she really felt like she wanted me to be absolutely blunt in what I was telling her. And so one day she handed me a manuscript and asked for feedback, and I took her at face value. And I just told her what I thought, and it was an absolute disaster. Again, despite all this that I've just said about trying to be student-centered, students don't necessarily know what they want, and there's a lot of work to do to try to recover from that moment. But finally, I also feel a little bit compelled to say, doing this well doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be recognized by our trainees. This last bit of data I'll show you is taken from a suturing task. Students did a pre-test on this task. They got an educational intervention. They did better. And then they were randomized to either be told what they've done well or to be given constructive feedback. At that point, the group that got constructive feedback continued to improve, reinforcing that self-assessment isn't sufficient. Those in the compliment group didn't know for themselves how to keep getting better. But the reason for showing this here at the end is that unfortunately, those in the compliment group gave higher teacher ratings. It felt better to them. They felt like they had learned something because they were told how well they did it. So I'll leave you with that moment of distress. And thank you for your patience.